Subscribe to Audio Novels for more content and click on the bell icon. We hope you enjoy the video. Thank you.
Gashan, a high-pitched noise, reverberated indoors. The noise, which would make one close their ears with both their hands reflexively, was produced by a man who seemed to be in his mid-30s, growing a Kaiser beard, holding a staff which shined with a black luster, and donning a high-collared military uniform. He had smashed a huge vase, which was about 1 meter tall, with the staff grasped in his right hand. White petals fluttered down as the leaking water spread onto a deep crimson carpet. "How will you take responsibility for this? I am extremely sorry. Please forgive me. Don't screw around, you inferior woman." The man's face was dyed with anger. The phrase, demonic expression, indicated his facial features perfectly in the current situation. Like a raging fire, in his anger, which was as though it couldn't be satisfied by merely smashing a vase, he was using foul language to abuse the servant in front of him, who was on her knees, bowing her head down and offering words of apology while crying. There was also the appearance of a young woman, wearing a resplendent dress, hugging a young boy, and looking at the servant with scorn in her eyes, next to the man. At a glance, it seemed as though the man in the military uniform and the woman in the dress were verbally assaulting a lone servant. Comprehending the current state of affairs, Hirasawa Kazuki came to the following conclusion. Maybe this is a game event? It might seem like a flustered and crazy conclusion, but there was a reason this conclusion was reached. Kazuki recognized this figure and this scene. Presently, the sequence of arguments unfolding in front of him bore a resemblance to a scene in the single-player RPG, Brave Hearts, which was up for sale a few years ago. He was able to recall it instantly because he was a fan of the game, and no other reason. Even the fingers on both hands weren't enough to count the number of times he had completely played the game. There was no mistake, since the dialogue of the characters in each event scene was more or less memorized. The man in the military uniform and the woman in the dress were the parents of a character appearing in the game, and the servant, begging for forgiveness while crying, was the mother of the main character of the game. Grasping the circumstances up until there, Kazuki, who was being hugged by the woman in the dress from some time, falls into a state of extreme confusion and comes to a standstill. Why are the characters of a game moving? In the first place, is this reality? Is something happening to my body? His thoughts were racing with each emerging question. Abruptly being dropped into this scene of fighting, to which his comprehension couldn't catch up, a single thing was clear. I'll be troubled if I'm thrown into such a depressing event all of a sudden, though. For argument's sake, if the current scene were to trace the scenario of the game, then the servant, Clara's, life was in an extremely precarious situation. Based on Kazuki's thoughts, it could be guessed that this is an event where the servant is killed. Clara's life is taken by the hands of Harold, the son of the man in the military uniform. Where is Harold? Dear Harold, the vital character. If I'm not mistaken, in this scene, his anxious mother is Inoue. And then, Kazuki realizes a fact which comes as a huge blow, that his current position is the same as Harold's. A certain uncomfortable feeling rose up like a link. It was a concern about the height of his field of view. Even though he was firmly standing on both his legs, his field of view was considerably lower. This event scene is shown as a reflection of the past in the story. His exact age was unknown, but at that occasion, Harold was a boy of about 10 years old. Various factors displayed an unpleasant coincidence. Perhaps I have become Harold. That was a preposterous thought that hit him. It wasn't as though there was any proof. But the instant that possibility went across his head, severe chills ran down his spine. No, what am I saying? This is a dream, if I think about it normally. As though to shake off an unpleasant premonition, he persuades himself. That is the most acceptable answer, according to common sense. No matter how desperately his reasoning claims that this is a dream, the warmth transmitted from being hugged, the angry voice striking his ears, carrying a sense of reality, screams at Kazuki's 5 senses. No matter how much he denies it, in no way could it be thought of as a dream. Well then, since I know that this isn't a dream, as expected, is this the game world? There's no way. But this feeling of reality can only be thought of as but still, the world of the game? If thought of like that, then isn't Clara-san going to die? Being torn between the conflicting thoughts of his reasoning and instinct, Kazuki could only act like an idiot. He wanted to stop thinking, since his thoughts were repeatedly going around in circles. As though it was cut off from his will, his body moved in contrast with his thoughts. Shaking off his mother's arm, his legs advance step by step. There is no merit in lending ears to you begging for your life. That corrupt blood, I will personally purge it. Father, wait, entrust the execution of this woman to me. The man had taken the sword which was hung on the wall, ready to cut down the servant. From behind him, Harold spoke words of restraint. Kazuki was familiar with those words as he had seen them on screen. He spoke the dialogue which wasn't voiced out in the game originally, in the voice of Harold, which he had gotten used to. Intervening at that point wasn't entirely only his intention. To you, what do you plan to do? Recently, I learned a new magic. Let her become a guinea pig for testing that. Instead of dirtying the room with the blood of an inferior species like this, isn't that a better use? He found out that the corners of his lips rose up. Contrary to Kazuki's feelings, a villainous smile floated up. It goes even without saying, but Kazuki didn't even have the slightest bit of complacency to express the smile. On top of being placed in an incomprehensible situation, his body overturning his will and taking action on its own was an unendurable terror for him. Kazuki hadn't piled up an abundance of life experience to think fast in such a situation. A person who can adapt to and deal with such a situation surpasses what can be called as calm or skillful and can only be called as a freak. Fortunately or unfortunately, Kazuki wasn't a freak. But if viewed from another angle, this meant that the flow of this event was irreversible. Ho ho, that might also be amusing. Until then, throw this woman in the dungeon. As soon as military uniform raises his voice, immediately a soldier arrives and drags Clara away by grabbing her hand. Kazuki could only see off her retreating figure off. Filthy mixed blood. Even though she was hired after I took pity on her, when asked to do something, she can't do even a single thing properly. After all, she is an inferior species. Harold wants to test his magic, so she might be useful. Humph, that is also true. As though looking at an object which was filthy, their eyes had no intention of hiding their disgust. This married couple didn't even perceive the servant, Clara, as a human being. Under normal circumstances towards this, Kazuki would have expressed his discomfort. However, since his outlook had contracted due to the chaos, the married couple's speech and conduct didn't reach his ears. Even if it had reached him, he wouldn't have properly perceived the contents. He had fallen into a stupor for several minutes. Let alone his surroundings, since then, what kind of conversations he exchanged with whom, how he reached this location. Not a single thing did he have a recollection of. When he finally came to his senses, Kazuki was in a room, of which he had no memories, resting deeply on a single-person sofa, with his gaze wandering about in empty space. Where is this? Is this Harold's room? While muttering with a powerless voice, without an aim, he looked around inside the room with swimming eyes. Since it doesn't appear during the course of the game, its accurate parts aren't known, but from the feeling he got from looking at the width of the room, the canopied bed, the sofa he was resting on, he could guess as to whom this room belonged to. In a corner of the room, there was a full-length mirror whose height was greater than a grown male's. Kazuki swallowed his saliva, with a sharp sound resounding from his throat. Standing up after putting all his power into his trembling knees, he walked towards the full-length mirror with unsteady footsteps. To confirm his hypothesis, while praying that his hypothesis was off. As he gets closer step by step, his heartbeat increased violently, and his breathing also became fast and shallow. And yet, Kazuki didn't stop his steps. And finally, he stood in front of the full-length mirror. He slowly raised his face, from a position where his head was bent low, where he could only see the tips of his foot. Facing the full-length mirror, he opened his tightly shut eyelids. The person who was reflected from its surface was without a doubt. It's a lie, right? Ruthlessly depicted was the figure of Harold with the appearance of a young boy. Glossy black hair and red pupils. Even if he didn't want to, he could feel that Harold's face had the features found on people outside Japan, and even far away from Asia. Roughly 140 centimeters in height, and as expected, aged approximately 10 years. Dressed in a pure white shirt with a cross-tie and knee-high half-pants, he had the appearance which was exactly like a painting of a young boy coming from a distinguished and noble family. Hirasawa Kazuki had become Harold Stokes. It seemed hard to accept, but with this, he had practically confirmed that this was the truth. Neither the reasoning nor the process was understood. Well then, should this situation be gathered as possessing a person, or should it be fine with viewing it as a frighteningly real dream? Or maybe Hirasawa Kazuki had switched places with Harold Stokes, or it might also be that the consciousness of Hirasawa Kazuki had been birthed by the delusions of the owner of this body that had gone crazy. The loss of a factor to verify one's self, attacked by a feeling of as though losing all the support from his feet, at the same time as he put his hands on his knees, which had lost almost all their strength. He held back the sense of nausea which was welling up. His breathing was agonizing, and his visibility was dyed white due to vertigo, while his gastric juices rampaged around in the opposite direction. In any case, it was an awful feeling. Shall I throw away everything as it is and just sleep? With such irresponsible feelings, Kazuki collapsed onto the bed. He didn't have any willpower left to work out his thoughts. Waking up after sleeping and telling, "It was all a dream, I was seriously flustered," muttering that, he wipes off his cold sweat. Clinging on to that hope, as his consciousness was drifting off, it was pulled back into his body due to the knocking sounds on the door. "Come in." The thought of feigning ignorance passed through his mind, but before he could think deeply about it, he gave out a reply. It wasn't clear whether it was Harold's will or Kazuki's subconsciousness. But I wouldn't abruptly tell them to come in. Without even knowing who it was, talking in such a rude manner, Kazuki wasn't a person who didn't know about courtesy. If that is the case, like before, did his body move on its own? Since he had already replied, without a choice, he raised his languid body up while thinking such thoughts, which put him in an even more depressing mood. While that may be true, it wasn't as though the visitor would refrain from entering into the room. A man with greying hair opened the door, bowed respectfully, and stepped inside the room. Looking at his face, Kazuki realized who the other person was. Norman, he who serves as a butler in this estate, given the nickname Conscience of the Stokes house by the players, is a character affectionately called as Norman-san. Since he was just a butler and not a blood relative, he wasn't a member of the Stokes family. Anyway, he, who becomes a refreshing agent to the heart in the event related to the highly ranked and valued Stokes house, stepped into Kazuki's, Harold's room. "Excuse my rudeness. What business do you have? To be honest, I want to consult Harold-sama about..." Norman's words trailed off at the middle of his sentence. Feeling suspicious, Kazuki intently watched Norman's face. When he did that, the words which followed bewildered him. "Perhaps, are you feeling unwell? Then, there's no problem. But your complexion is. I'm telling you that there's no problem." Without even an ounce of consideration, he cut off Norman's words filled with concern and discarded them. Honestly, there were all kinds of problems, but it wasn't as though he could straightforwardly convey, "Actually, it seems like I have possessed Harold-kun." And so, when he mildly wanted to refuse, it became like this. It seemed as though this mouth automatically translated words into Harold's style. Was the previous "come in" also the work of this mouth? If that was the case, what an annoying feature this was. In response to Harold's blunt reaction, Norman felt that something was out of place. The young Harold that he was aware of had extreme hatred towards holding back, and would never work hard, would run away from pain, and would eliminate everything he disliked. His parents were also largely responsible for generally approving something like that. That is to say, if Harold was feeling unwell, instead of enduring it like this, he would have exaggeratedly cried out about his condition. However, only on this day alone did he not do this, urging to continue the conversation, even though his face was extremely pallid. He thought about speaking at a later time, but looking at Harold's eyes, which were screaming, "Hurry up and speak," Norman continued the conversation. "Then, I'll be brief. I am requesting for reduction of the punishment imposed on Clara." When he heard that, Kazuki remembered the reality that the current him holds the life of a person. The shock of realizing that he had become Harold was too big, due to which his memory had lapsed completely. His mouth had spouted out the dialogue of the event, where he makes the servant as the test subject for his new magic, on its own. And naturally, Kazuki had no intentions of doing that. That being the case, as he was about to instantly consent to Norman's request, he wasn't even able to form them into words. It wasn't as though Harold's will obstructed him. It was that Kazuki himself swallowed down the words. This was because he had to answer according to the situation, since he had knowledge about the original work. If the situation followed the original work, then the servant, Clara, would be burned to death by Harold's magic. As a result, the woman's daughter, Colette, would be driven out of the Stokes territory, since she would have no relatives. Before long, Colette, who would have collapsed due to the exhaustion of both mind and body, would then be sheltered and would start to live with the original work's protagonist and his family under the same roof. In short, Colette was the main heroine, and if Clara was saved now, she wouldn't encounter the protagonist, which would be a huge deviation from the story. Kazuki realized this and was at a loss for words. In the end, this was just a possibility. There was a possibility that even if Clara was either saved or killed, Colette might encounter the protagonist and become his friend. The phenomenon which could be called as the power to alter history. If this power worked, even if Kazuki moved as he pleased, then for better or for worse, there was no need for him to worry. If that is true, then the events of the original work can't be avoided, and my future would be pitch black. Let me assume that a power like that doesn't exist. If he hadn't done that, Kazuki's mental health would have taken a hit. Conversely, if a thing like the altering power doesn't operate, using the knowledge about the original work, Kazuki could avoid the messed up actions taken by Harold, and it wouldn't be extremely difficult to behave in a way that wouldn't lower his impression. A ray of hope rose up in Kazuki's heart. For that purpose, if I take actions which deviate too much from the original work, I would lose an advantage, which would be a poor plan. Without changing the scenario in a broad sense, if I could guide only the conclusion to a decent direction, then... As it was, if he didn't take any actions, and the scenario progressed completely in accordance with the original work, in a few more years, Kazuki would welcome death. He must do everything he can to avoid that. However, what kind of influence the destruction of the original story causes wasn't known. Much less in an RPG world where death was ever closer. In a world like this, knowing the rough flow of the future was the greatest advantage, and if this was ignored, death might come due to a development absent in the original work. A colossal death flag called the world of survival of the fittest. To take on both those parties and survive, the flow of the original work must be drawn, while it would be fine to move forward by breaking down his own flag. Anyway, Kazuki strengthened his resolve to do all he could before he could start talking pretentiously, if he didn't want to die. Norman was startled by seeing Kazuki's eyes, which were harboring such a stubborn determination. This was because he had never seen the boy making such eyes previously. "Clara is that servant, right? Bastard, are you telling me to act for the sake of rescuing her?" Kazuki instantly regretted the opening of his mouth. As for Kazuki, his intention was to tell. "Clara-san was the servant from some time ago, right? I really want to save her, but I cannot move openly." How freely was that translated for the remark to be like this? Naturally, as though he was dispirited, Norman's expression became clouded. This is bad. Kazuki felt through his body that the flow had become extremely bad. The way things were going, his hate points was going to increase from the already existing amount. Somehow trying to gloss over things, he frantically squeezed out words. "If you want to help, to start with, move on your own. I will listen to your words after that. In that case, importunate, get out immediately." Kazuki, flustered by his own mouth spouting out abusive language more than what was expected, made Norman leave, by driving him out mid-sentence. Seeing him leave while expressing gratitude even after such treatment, Kazuki was relieved that his will to somewhat cooperate was conveyed. Throwing himself down on the bed, Looking up this time, Kazuki started to reflect deeply on his careless thinking. He cannot avoid taking back his previous opinion already. As long as this mouth was there, it seemed that it would be a considerably difficult problem to alter only the conclusion of the event without lowering his impression. While that may be true, he couldn't just tell. As expected, shall I give up? If the worst situation was to be assumed, the situation where death in this world would, without a doubt, be the death of Hirasawa Kazuki, which would be extremely troublesome. There might also be a possibility of returning back to his original world by dying here, but the risk was too high for him to put it into action. And so, until the clue to escape the current situation was caught, the best way to survive, as Harold Stokes, was to act in accordance with the original work and avoid taking screwed-up actions. In that way, with a situation close to the original works, if the flow of this world was continued to be observed closely, it would become clear whether this place was the same world of brave hearts, or a world which was a counterfeit of it. And so, what was it that Kazuki ought to do now? It was to gather information, to get a good grasp on the present situation. Kazuki, who had recovered his energy to a certain extent due to the discovery of hope, got off the bed and started rummaging through the drawers and searching the bookshelf. When he did that, other than general goods, he also found some items which had appeared in the game. Nearly everything stowed on the bookshelf were books related to magic or biographies which contained lots of illustrations. Fortunately, the books were written in Japanese, which could be read even by Kazuki. As expected, it might be a world of Made in Japan. After briefly finishing his search, he went out of the room. In order to talk with Clara, he calls out to an armored soldier who was nearby. "Oi, bastard! Ha ha!" The soldier bent down on one knee and lowered his head. By the way, he stopped minding about the use of his language in each and every single situation. "Lead me to the dungeon where the servant called Clara is imprisoned." "To the dungeon? What? If you have any objections, I'll listen to them." "No, I don't. This way, please." With brisk movements, the soldier took the lead. The armor was clattering noisily. It looked like it would be an annoyance if he wandered around in the mansion during night. He followed behind the soldier like that for a short while. They arrived in front of a desolate-looking building with a height of 3 meters, made out of stone, situated behind the mansion. This is the dungeon. How many people are imprisoned? For now, it should be a single person, but if it was like that, it seemed that the only one inside was Clara. For Kazuki, this was convenient. You remain here and keep a lookout so that no one comes inside. Certainly. Making the soldier stand outside, only Kazuki entered inside the building after opening the wooden door. "Ha, Harold-sama!" In the narrow room, which had the appearance of a guard room, there was the form of yet another soldier. Lying down upon the chair, which was lined up, was the posture of the soldier, indicating his blatant idling. The soldier, hurriedly trying to rise up, tripped and fell down from the chair. Kazuki ignored that and extended his hand to an iron grill, furnished on the ground in the left-hand corner of the room, which appeared to lead to the dungeon. When he pulled it, he found that it was locked tightly. "Hand over the key!" Yes! The soldier handed over a key to Harold, from the ones hung on the wall. He inserted the key into the keyhole, and when he turned it to the left side, the lock opened with a loud clank. "I have to talk with the person in the dungeon. Don't you dare enter." Nailing down that point, he descended the stairway leading to the dungeon while he still held the key, so that he wouldn't get locked in, even if by chance. The stairway was gloomy, and even the steps couldn't be seen properly. He finally reached the prison after carefully descending the 10-odd steps. The prison had a total of 4 cells, 2 on each side. Each cell only had something which seemed like a bed made only out of straw and a simple toilet out in the open. On the wall at the other side of the prison was a small window, with a height of 20 centimeters and a width of 30 centimeters, through which a small amount of light was illuminating the prison. Kazuki stopped his feet in front of the cell situated at the interior right-hand side, in which Clara was imprisoned. "There is no mistake that you are Clara Emerald, right?" "Harold-sama." Kazuki stood in front of Clara's cell in a position where she could not make out his facial features. It was at the level where she could only guess at who it was from looking at the small silhouette of the person and listening to the voice of the person. However, a doubt rose up in her mind. A doubt about why he came here. Perhaps. Has that time already come? Her voice shook. A test subject for experimenting a new magic. The boy standing in front of her had definitely told that some time ago. Thinking that the time had already come, Clara's face was etched with an even more deeper color of despair. But the reply from Harold was something which greatly deviated from her prediction. If that is your wish, then I will do so, but currently it's for a different matter. Harold folded his arms and leaned his back on the iron bars of the opposite cell. She thought about what he meant by a different matter. She had already worked in this mansion for almost 2 years, and the amount of times she had directly conversed with Harold was uncountable. But still, she tilted her head in confusion. A different matter, is it? Just confirmation. You only need to answer my questions without any lies or deception. Okay, I will answer all the questions you ask me. The vigor with which Clara could show agreement was only by nodding. It was completely different from how he normally behaved, where he always wanted to have his own way. She was swallowed by the atmosphere given off by Harold, who was emitting a calm and composed aura and was unbecoming of his age. What is the composition of your family? I have a single daughter. What is her name? She is called Colette. What about blood relatives or close family members other than her? I left my hometown with my husband, which was similar to running away, and from then on it was a state of isolation from my house. 3 years ago, due to a disease, my husband. So there was reason like that for Colette not having a relative other than her mother. The purpose of the questioning was for comparing and adjusting the knowledge of the original work. Clara was getting baffled by listening to him asking questions about her circumstances, which had nothing to do with her punishment, but Kazuki paid no heed to that and persistently continued to interrogate her. The age of your daughter is? She becomes 9 this year. Do you have any experience in martial arts or using any magic? No, things like that in particular. The time it took was a few minutes. Kazuki indifferently repeated the questions. The outcome was rather good. All the information obtained from Clara was consistent with Kazuki's. With this, all the information that could be obtained at this stage was present, and he was able to decide on what to do hereafter. That's it. Well then, wait for a moment, please. Clara pleaded for Kazuki, who was about to leave, to halt. What? If I die, then my daughter, Colette, will be all alone. At that age, she wouldn't even be able to survive if she is left alone. Clara tells that while shedding tears. Therefore, after my death, please take care of my daughter. That girl has done no wrong. Please, please, I beg you. Instead of worrying about her own life, she, who was anxious about the future of her child, begged while groveling and bowing her head to the one whom she should hate to the core, who was similar to a person falsely accusing her. If it was the real Harold, he might have ridiculed and laughed at that appearance. But Kazuki was different. He could currently sense the unconditional love from a mother to a daughter, from Clara. Kazuki couldn't laugh at the mother who was begging for the happiness of her daughter, instead of worrying about her own life. He now held the conviction that she was an existence that was absolutely indispensable for Colette. The likes of killing such a person was improbable. Unsightly. That appearance, and also the utter stupidity of being seized by needless and meaningless anxiety. For Harold, this seemed to be consoling words. Up to what extent does his haughty attitude go? That is, what do you mean by? Without answering Clara's question, Kazuki starts to walk away. If he were to stay in front of her any more than this, it seemed as though he would start crying out of sympathy. Turning his back on her, Kazuki briefly told her, "If you love her to that extent, never again let go of her." Before long, the sound of footsteps also vanished, and the sound of the iron grill at the entrance being closed resounded out inside the dungeon. Clara absent-mindedly gazed at the darkness, through which Harold had disappeared, digesting the words he had left behind. This despair is needless anxiety, is it? Can I once again embrace Colette with these arms? There was no one to answer the murmur which leaked out from Clara, and those words were swallowed up by the silence. She didn't know why, but she now felt as though the silence was tender. Even though he had obtained important information, he was far from finding a solution to the problematic situation. There was a need to form a concrete plan to save Clara and Colette. For now, Kazuki thought out that the two of them needed to leave the Stokes territory and shift their residence to the Brosk village, where the Liner family of the original work's protagonist lived. The probability of Colette and Liner coming across each other would be the highest when Clara is still alive. As long as one had played the original work, they would know that the Brosh village was in no way large. And from the remarks of Liner in the game, they would also know that all the village children knew each other. The problem was whether Colette and Liner would develop a close relationship, as in the game. As long as Clara was still alive, it would be difficult to produce a situation where Colette would live together with the Liner family. In that case, he was ruminating whether he could somehow, or the other, place Colette in the childhood friend's position. Even though he was groaning, "Umumu," no bright ideas came to mind. The one who appeared at such a time where he was reaching his limits was none other than Norman. "Excuse me." Kazuki, who saw Norman bowing down his head in the exact same manner he had done a few hours ago, thought, as expected, a well-disciplined butler is different, and felt moved meaninglessly. If there was something different from before, it was the bundle of sheets held in both his hands. "Harold-sama, how are you feeling? How many times will you make me say it? There's no problem. And what is that?" These are the map of the Stokes territory and its surroundings, and the information regarding the settlements in and around the neighborhood of the territory. Norman-san, efficiently done. He held back that shout of delight, which would destroy his character. Well, even if he had told something, it would be translated into something ominous like, "Who, a bit impetuous, aren't you?" which might not even seem like a compliment. Nevertheless, it seemed as though, in just a few hours, Norman gathered up the huge amount of information. He decided to ignore asking him about what he did with the original work he was assigned. "Well worked. Well then, how the hell do you plan to save that servant?" "It is extremely difficult for me to say this, but I think that it would be ideal for her to migrate outside the territory of the Stokes house." This was a huge wager for Norman. Sending people out of the territory, this would reduce the manpower and also the revenue that could be collected from them. Harold was thinking that there was no need to mind it, since, right from the start, he had no intention of killing her. Norman never thought that Harold was thinking like that. He thought that Harold might feel unpleasant due to the manpower and revenue becoming the property of other nobles, the thing called a noble's honor. Is that so? Where is the candidate town located? That is, here. However, looking at Harold responding as though nothing had happened, Norman, who was partly vigilant, was let down. Harold was looking through the document brought by Norman while listening to him. That attitude was seriousness itself. In fact, being enthusiastic about Norman's proposal, he promptly started to think about a plan to deal with the point which appeared to be problematic. The things that need to be gathered to migrate outside the territory is numerous. In the first place, is it even possible to come and go out of the territory of the other nobles easily? For individuals, there are no particular regulations. However, if we send her off without anything to an unknown land, the circumstances of her livelihood might be hard. I think that a minimum amount of materials are required. If that was the case, there was a need to use a small, horse-drawn cart. Of course, a horse-drawn cart of the Stokes house. And for a cart belonging to a noble or a merchant to pass through, a transit permit was indispensable. With the goods, if the daughter is also added to that, the utilization of a cart cannot be avoided. Then, there is also a need to do something or the other regarding the transit permit. Really, there is nothing more problematic than this whole damn thing. Contrary to his words, his eyes don't leave the document even for an instant. And Norman was surprised to see that Harold had a grasp on the matters concerning Clara and her family, as though it was obvious. He had thought that normally Harold was indifferent like his parents. Perhaps. No, it must be so. Harold-sama, even at his age, must be thinking about the people. Therefore, didn't he ask the one who had proposed to save her to tackle the situation personally? If thought about it like that, everything fell into place. Also, wasn't the bragging about using her as a test subject for his new magic to hide her who was about to get slain in a safe place for the time being? Without showing disapproval at losing the almost non-existent profit from the manpower and revenue of a single person, wasn't he seriously trying to save her without putting on airs? While thinking about the future, Clara running away to a land where the Stokes house's power doesn't reach would be the safest for her. That being the case, rejecting that suggestion would be idiotic. From the start, Kazuki was moving to save her. It was natural that he wanted to give it his all when he was unexpectedly requested for assistance in that matter. Passionate feelings welled up in Norman's heart, and simultaneously, he felt ashamed at himself for being suspicious towards Harold. He shouldn't be doubting the young boy, who was groping around for a solution to save a single servant in such an earnest manner. If the boy himself was so serious, then he must also be serious. When he thought like that, his tone also naturally became passionate. In this town, in the following season, due to the harvest festival, they constantly require help. Compared to the Stokes territory, the cost of living is high, if there is no environment where they gain a stable income. Regarding his opinion, Harold precisely pointed out the problem, with the document as his basis, that thinking ability, outlook and knowledge weren't that of a 10-year-old. Inside the young boy's body was a university student, so it wasn't a mystery that he was able to do that. But Norman, who didn't know that, couldn't help but think that he was a prodigy. He would know whether it was effective. When they began eating dinner, to deceive his father, he was able to smoothly lie. "Father, right, I have a request." "What is it, Harold?" "Recently, it seems that a blacksmith has opened up a shop in Leitzer, and it also seems that the swords sold there are amazing. I also wish to try swinging them. Fumu, in that case, shall we send a servant to randomly buy some swords from there? That will take some time. I want it now, as soon as possible. Harold really is gallant. In the future, he will become a splendid noble like you, dear." His mother was laughing with a ho 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 ho. Kazuki didn't know why he was gallant for just wanting a sword, but since it was no different than being a covering fire, he decided to take advantage of it. Mother is also telling that, "Hey, isn't it fine? If there is a transit permit, we can send someone to buy them for my use. Doesn't Harold seem like he really wants it? Dear, won't it be fine to just write a few lines?" "All right, then, tomorrow morning I will write the transmit permit." "Thank you, Father." If one only looked at the dining table filled with laughter, they would think that it was an intimate and happy family. But for the surrounding servants, it wasn't a thing that they could warmly watch over. Everybody knew that they only thought of the servants as rocks on the side of a road. It would be the same even if they were there or not there. In the first place, they don't even notice them. Even though it was the family of their employer, they couldn't find those kind of people likable. The bleak harmony, formed from talking with the current head and his wife, advanced with the night. But nobody present here knew that this was a scene which was false. Except for Kazuki and Norman. There were some vigorous movements the next day, mainly by two soldiers. These were the two soldiers who knew the actions Kazuki had taken the day before. To impose a gag order on this time's plan to save Clara, thinking that it would be desirable to limit the number of people who were concerned with it, Kazuki had confirmed whether these two were people who could be trusted with confidential work from Norman the day before. Norman's answer was a yes. For Kazuki, it was fortunate, but it was hard to say for the soldiers. Called by Harold early in the morning, when they headed to his room, filled with trepidation, thinking about exactly what they were called for, all of a sudden, they were given an explanation about the plan to save the servant. Without their understanding, catching up to the situation, the one thing that was carved deeply into the hearts of the two soldiers and the coachman of the horse cart, who was called like them, was that if this plan failed and was discovered by a third party, their lives would be in danger. Therefore, one of the soldiers completed the orders given one after the other with a he. The other one was running around the town at the same time. The only one who was at ease was the coachman, who had no work until night. "Ha, Harold-sama, I have bought all the goods and come back. Toss them into the dungeon while not being seen. After finishing that, ride the horse and confirm the route to the highway with your own eyes. But I still haven't brought the horse along. It'll be fine if you borrow a horse from the ones in the mansion and go. However, give it an injury that arouses suspicion. Come back before it gets dark." No mercy. Precisely Spartan. If explained why, since Kazuki himself was at his wit's end, he didn't have enough room to pay attention to his surroundings. Confirming that the soldier had headed towards the stable, Kazuki resumed practicing his magic. The magic he was practicing was the low-grade magic, Flame Column. Directly translated, it was Pillar of Fire, Hibashira. The magic which was thought to be fired by Harold in the original work to kill Clara. They actually didn't know what it was, but among the players who had watched the movie scene, its probably Flame Column was what they had widely perceived it as, and so he decided to conform to it. Well, it was relatively inconsequential, but it couldn't be helped that its power was weak. At first, with embarrassment added to him thinking whether he could really use magic, he performed the chant. Surprisingly, when it succeeded in the first try, as expected, he was excited, but when he looked at it properly, it only rose up to a height of 40 centimeters, and its thickness was also about as small as an aluminum can. In the original work, it had a height and thickness which could easily envelop a grown woman, and in the combat scene, it looked as though it was a pillar of fire which had a height of 2-3 meters. If this body really was that of Harold Stokes, then it should also be possible for Kazuki to do it. It wasn't as though he would burn Clara to death, so Kazuki also knew that it wasn't absolutely necessary for it to have so much firepower. Even for the actual performance, he had no intentions to activate the magic as extensively as shown in the movie scene. That said, since he was letting Clara get away, there was no way he could show a corpse, and so he needed enough firepower to show that he had burnt her so much that not even cinders remained. For that reason, from some time ago, Kazuki was practicing magic while simultaneously leaving burn marks on the ground and tree trunks, and also burning leaves. Even though it was an open location, he was still inside a forest with dense, overgrown trees. Carefully paying attention so as to not start a forest fire, he was repeating a truly boring operation. Phew, it should be enough to this degree. There was no change in his arrogant tone, even though he was speaking to himself. For Harold, it seemed as though this was how he spoke originally. Leaving that aside, for the time being, he disguised the vicinity as though it was the aftermath of a fire. Later, for the act, to show this off, if he just made a pillar of fire, it would be thought that it wasn't a mystery that the corpse had been burnt off. Honestly, he was a bit anxious. Or rather, he was full of anxiety. Since his decision would divide whether a person died or not, there was no way his mind could be calm. After all, they are game characters. Even if he thought of it like that, after actually exchanging words with them and experiencing those emotions, they were already human beings, as far as Kazuki was concerned. He couldn't possibly view them as just computer icons. No matter how much preparations he had set up, with this, it's absolutely fine. He probably couldn't be convinced that that was the case. On the contrary, currently for Kazuki, that was fortunate. When he came to his senses, he was lost in a world which seemed to be inside a game, and he was currently personally experiencing the unprecedented situation of possessing a character's body. Under such a situation, it wouldn't be easy to keep calm. However, presently, Kazuki could see the life-threatening crisis approaching him, and since he was doing his all to avoid it, he didn't have the leeway to be concerned with other affairs. It was close to a kind of running away from reality, but it was an unshakable fact that by doing so, he maintained mental stability. With this, is it really fine? Do any defects exist in the plan that I have thought out? Is there anything more that I have to do? Kazuki, without stopping these thoughts, was immersed in making careful preparations until the sunset. And then, the long-awaited full moon night came. In the forest illuminated by moonlight, Clara arrived, led by the soldier. She wasn't wearing the maid outfit that servants normally wore, but casual clothes often seen in the town. During daytime, Kazuki had sent the soldier to buy them and had ordered him to tell her to change into those clothes. Keep quiet. He rudely interrupted Clara, who was uneasy. Even now, Kazuki was extremely nervous. For a while, the strained silence continued. Kazuki, Norman, Clara and Soldier A, the one who was slacking off yesterday. The thing that broke off the silence which had descended upon these people was the sound of a horse's hooves impacting on the ground, from far away. Finally, deep from inside the forest, from the direction of the town, the ones who appeared were the soldier, who was brushing aside plants, and a small girl, riding on 2 horses. When they saw each other, Clara and the girl simultaneously raised their voices. "Mama! Colette!" Clara strongly embraced the little girl, who was let down from the horse. With that in his peripheral vision, Kazuki received the report from the soldier. "Sorry for being late, Harold-sama. It took some time to cross the forest while pulling the horse, so—" "That is inconsequential. While bringing that girl, was your figure seen by the town folk?" "No problem. But it seems as though a person going from the town to the mansion like her has leaked out the circumstances, and rumors that Clara was already going to be killed are spreading out." He involuntarily clicked his tongue. Now that it was mentioned, it was obvious, but he didn't think that far ahead. As expected, he still wasn't calm enough. But for now, he didn't have the leisure to worry about it. He put off regretting and reflecting for a later time. To the 2 people who were hugging each other with tears floating in their eyes, he talked to them in a compromising tone. "I'll present 2 choices to you bastards." In front of the faces of the 2 people who were looking up at Kazuki, he raised up his index finger. "First, die here." Towards Kazuki's words, Colette let out a voice as though she was convulsing. In contrast to that, Clara was staring straightforwardly at Kazuki's eyes. In front of their eyes, he next raised up his second finger. "Second, discard this land and start a new livelihood outside the Stokes territory." "Eh?" With this suggestion, as expected, even Clara opened her eyes wide. Outside the territory, in other words, if they migrated to another noble's territory, the Stokes house couldn't interfere with their lives. That is, acquittal. If the latter option is chosen, then it will be declared that you bastards are dead. Coming back here once again isn't permitted, and all the connections made until now must be severed. Will you forgive me? Murmuring as though partly in a daze, Clara uttered that. About what? But, in a haughty manner, Harold asked that question in return. As for Kazuki, he wanted to tell. What is it about? And play dumb with a smile. First of all, the cause of this racket was when Harold bumped into Clara, who was watering the flower bed, and after slipping down, he got dirty. It was clear that it was a really stupid incident in the game. It couldn't just be called as pitiful, getting killed for such a thing. For this reason, the resentment Colette felt towards Harold in the original game was extremely high. Naturally, Kazuki didn't even think of it as anything, and it wasn't as though he was angry, since his consciousness only surfaced after the incident. It's fine, so quickly choose. As for me, it would be convenient and helpful if I killed you here and now. I'm extremely sorry. I feel that I still want to continue living with this girl. With this, if she told something like, "Please kill me," all the troubling things he had worked for would come to nothing. First of all, there was no way Kazuki could carry out the act of killing people. Fun, boring. Then, take this and go. Kazuki produced a jute bag from his breast pocket and casually threw it towards them. Opening that drawstring bag and casting a glance at the insides, Clara stiffened up due to being surprised once again. This is consolation money. Don't spout out that you don't know what it means. Thank you very much. Clara put her hands on the ground and with a quivering voice expressed her gratitude. The money itself was the allowance his father had given, when Harold had told that he wanted a sword, and so it was hard for Kazuki to accept that gratitude frankly. I'll give this to you. As though hiding his embarrassment, Kazuki also handed over a thing to Colette. It was a necklace which had the emblem of the Knight Order of the Saint King, a single-edged sword imitating wings, giving off a silvery obsidian shine as an ornament. It was an article which he had discovered when he was in the middle of thoroughly searching Harold's room. Never let this part from you. Always wear it around your neck. This is the condition for letting you bastards run away. Understood? Yeah, yes. Although she was frightened, Colette nodded. But if a guy who wants it appears, give it to him. Only give it to a guy whose age is around yours and appears to be a bit skilled. In exchange for that, make him promise to protect you as a knight. Colette was confused at Harold's excessively detailed orders. Even if he wanted to explain it in a more simplified manner, his mouth wouldn't allow him to do that. Thereupon, a timely help came from beside him. Harold-sama is telling you to hand it over to a person who would protect you. Nice translation. Thinking that, Kazuki clenched his fist lightly and did a guts pose. Colette, who understood its meaning this time, rigorously nodded her head twice. Understood. Then go already. It is unbearable for me to be troubled by you bastards anymore. Turning around, Kazuki gave orders to the two soldiers. It was arranged that Clara and Colette were to ride the horses from here and were to be lead until the vicinity of the highway. After that, there was no other choice than to leave it to the soldiers A, B, and the coachman of the horse-drawn cart. Harold-sama, really, thank you very much. Just before straddling onto the horse, Clara and Colette together bent their waists deeply, announced that, and then left. Undoubtedly, they were showing their gratitude for him doing everything that was possible for them. However, originally speaking, Harold was the cause for all this, so there was no reason for them to thank him. Certainly, if it weren't for Kazuki, Clara might have died, but in the first place, if it weren't for Harold, then there was no way they would have fallen into such a predicament. For a rescue operation when I'm acting in my own play, even if you express gratitude, at least there was no way he could feel proud. Well, it's fine since Clara and Colette can live happily after this, thinking that, for the time being, he put a stop to the gloomy feelings in his heart. There was one last job left to do. Norman, go back first, understood. Norman responded to Harold's command after hesitating for a breath. Looking at Harold's expression, which seemed as though he was brooding over something, he hesitated because he was thinking whether it would be fine to leave this boy alone. However, that expression returned back to a calm one in a very small amount of time. In that case, now isn't the time to unnecessarily interject. Thinking that, Norman decided to withdraw. And then, he immediately realized that it was a mistake. While he was reluctantly heading back to the mansion, the wind carried Harold's voice to Norman's ears. When the voice, which was broken due to it being mixed among the sound of rustling of the tree leaves, reached his ears, Norman reflexively stopped walking. Ha, unsightly face, no value in living. The boy's voice, which could be heard faintly, contained self-derision. No way, forgiven as though repenting for one's sins. Life, useless. At least if death, right? And yet, it contained a sharpness which could cut through one's body. The monologue of a 10-year-old boy. With a cleverness unbecoming of a child, he saved the parent and child, and he, who had accomplished a praiseworthy thing, was suffering. All alone, so that no one could find out. It's over, flame column. A thunderous roar, together with a hot wind, blew through the forest. The pillar of fire, which was growing higher and higher, as though it was the manifestation of the feelings inside Harold's heart, was fiercely blazing, as though burning down the pain contained in that small body. The conflict held within Harold. Norman, catching a glimpse of that part and being petrified while in a daze, couldn't move until Harold came back, stamping on leaves and branches. Seeing Norman like that, Harold's expression warped. What are you doing at a place like this? I should have ordered you to go back first. Kazuki's tone became rough. This was because, just now, he had spoken out the dialogue of the event. In a place where nobody was present, mocking and laughing at a Clara who had already left long ago, and talking to himself while murmuring, this was a shame play where his dark history shined brilliantly. If somebody heard that, it was at the level where he would hang himself, or at least seriously consider doing it. Much less, if people started thinking that Harold was a sad person who had chunibyo, then it wouldn't just end with the destruction of his character. He would have to silence anyone who would expose that shameful behavior, because if he didn't, then there was a possibility that in the future it would lead to a troublesome situation. Everything that happened, Everything that you saw and everything that you heard today, forget about them completely. Otherwise, without telling it to anyone in the future, carry it to your grave. I won't accept an answer other than a yes. As though vigorously pressing for an answer, he keeps talking to Norman without a pause. It was something that he was desperate for to that extent, but that desperation held a different meaning in Norman's eyes. Trying to hide his weakness to such an extent, why, even though he is still a child, just how big of a responsibility is Harold-sama trying to carry? The attitude, obstinate enough to not depend on anyone else, was sorrow itself. But Norman could do nothing other than to nod his head. Taking a glance at Norman, who showed his acknowledgement, Harold left with a quick pace. That retreating figure looked as though it was extremely worn out. Perhaps Harold, taking his biological parents as a good example of what not to do, without having any real power presently, was trying to avoid a direct confrontation, and was deceiving them. He couldn't do anything other than that. If by chance his thoughts were discovered by his parents due to a third party, there was no mistake that it would give rise to some discord. If it were a normal kid, they would likely clash with their parents as it was. But since this boy was sagacious, he might have understood the dimensions by which it would affect the future, if he had done that. For the sake of it not becoming like that, he had chosen to deceive his parents and all the people in the mansion. Thus, not a single person who had anything to do with the Stokes house could see through his facade to know what he really was like. His motive for acting like he always was wouldn't have been clear if it wasn't for this irregular incident, and most probably, it also wouldn't be found out in the future. Towards the boy who was continuously fighting alone, he, who had judgmental thoughts, didn't have any rights to be worried about him. Norman found that to be unbearably vexing. No, I can't just keep regretting and do nothing. I'm surely going to keep regretting the fact that I couldn't get close to Harold during the past 10 years for my whole life. But doing only that won't solve anything. These 10 years of inactivity, there's no way other than to get it back from using all the remaining time, from now on. Until the day that kind boy loses the reason to keep tormenting his heart under the pretense of evil. How much time has passed from being shaken due to the cart? While stroking the hair of her daughter, who was sleeping using my lap as a pillow, she noticed the sky growing lighter. Daybreak must already be near. But still, Clara wasn't feeling drowsy and was feeling a fluffy sensation as though she was floating in mid-air. In these past 2 days, her world had turned around completely. When she was imprisoned in the jail, she already thought that she was going to be executed. The only thing she felt was the fear towards death and despair for leaving her only daughter alone. The one who saved her from that was a boy, whose age differed from her daughter's by only a single year. For the sake of a servant, who could be changed easily any number of times, he had handed over clothes, horses, and a cart, and also a huge amount of money for them to start a new life, free of charge. There was no way Harold's parents, who had abused Clara by calling her an inferior species, would allow such a thing, which meant that this was something he himself had done. While they were being escorted to the cart, she heard from the 2 soldiers about how the boy had saved them. First, telling that he wanted a sword from a famous blacksmith in Lietze, he obtained the transit permit. He gave it for the coachman's use, and then asked him to pretend departing to Lietze early in the morning, while he hid in the forest, which was in the vicinity of the highway, where there were less people, a bit away from the town. Meanwhile, the 2 soldiers, who were in civilian clothes so that they wouldn't stand out, went to the town to loan the horses and to buy and gather the necessary goods. Thanks to that, we ran around the town for the whole day, smiling wryly while telling that, but also feeling a bit proud, the soldiers narrated. And then, after entering Broche, Clara and Colette would remain in the village, while the horse cart and one of the soldiers would continue on to Lietze. It wouldn't look to be suspicious because, on the shortest route from the Stokes territory to Lietze, they would need to pass through Broche village. The round trip to Lietze would roughly take 4 to 6 days, so a delay of 1 full day was also within calculations. When Clara heard this, she couldn't help but be surprised. A 10-year-old boy had thought up such an elaborate plan in not even half a day, and had splendidly accomplished it like this. To add to that, the money given to her was the money given to him by his father to buy a sword for himself. Then, when they went to Lietza, they wouldn't be able to buy the sword. When Clara was worried about that, the coachman stifled his laughter. When she asked the reason for his laughter, he told her that he had asked Harold the same question when he had revealed the series of plans to him, and he had gotten this reply back. "Bastard, are you an idiot? Won't it be fine if you choose a cheap sword randomly?" It was as though there was some gentleness mixed in those sharp words. Maybe he had sensed that, since hearing the coachman telling it as though it was enjoyable left a deep impression on her. By no means could Clara's lifetime be called as smooth sailing, but still, Colette being born and encountering Harold, she thought that those two things were irreplaceable. "Clara-san, are you awake?" "Yes. Did something happen?" Brosh village is coming into view. Hearing the coachman's words, she peeked out from behind. The thing that came into Clara's view was, illuminated by the sun rays rising from the horizon and covered in morning mist, a sparkling Brosh village. We'll have arrived by the time the sun has completely risen. Until then, how about resting for a while? Thank you for your consideration. But for now, I want to burn this into my memory. Is that so? Well, I understand those feelings. Clara, the coachman, and even the two soldiers had their hearts stolen by the scenery which was like an illusion, by that form of Brosk village which was as though it was blessing Clara's and Colette's new life. Listening to Harold's report, his parents believed that Clara and her daughter Colette were dead. It was unlikely that they would even think of doubting their son. Even though their son had killed a woman and her child, seeing them only praising him extravagantly by telling, "You have talent in magic," Kazuki felt that the gap between him and his parents would never be covered in his whole lifetime. As long as they didn't rid themselves of this kind of sense of values, there was no way he could see eye to eye with them. Well, because of them blindly believing in him, they didn't doubt anything he told. So for now, that was more than enough, was what he thought. For now, it could be said that the plan to rescue Clara and Colette was a success. Truthfully, this was when he should have been happy, but confronted by a new problem. For Kazuki, time was precious. The most he could do was to pray that Colette would get close to Lina. Leaving that aside, the thing that was troubling Kazuki was how to deal with the growing displeasure of the populace due to the political pressure of the Stokes family. In short, it could be summed up as severe taxation. Since the Stokes territory, with the exception of the towering mountain range to the northeast, was facing the plains, and the highway was laid out as though running beside the city, it was considerably blessed in the field of transportation. There were no seas in the surroundings, but there was a river formed by a stream from the mountain range, which passed nearby, and a forest stretched out from the northwest to the eastern side, so it was a land suitable for forestry too. The circulation of people and money was good, and nature was abundant. Naturally, both primary and secondary industries were prosperous. However, since the Stokes territory wasn't very vast, they couldn't make use of those benefits. Advanced despite being a small town was the scope of it. On a self-governing area with that scope of economy, the Stokes family was imposing quite a heavy tax. For the residents living in the vicinity of the town centre who had considerably high income, it wasn't as though they couldn't pay the tax, but for the agricultural community living in the suburbs, it was quite a burden. Particularly, in the recent years, being assaulted by natural disasters as though it was an annual occurrence, the volume of crops harvested was unfavourable, and due to that, profit went down, and the farmers running under deficit weren't less. For that reason, voices rose up from the farms, appealing to reduce the tax temporarily, but there was no way that couple would lend their ears for something like that. On the contrary, the pressure was tightened by telling, "If you make any more noise, I will raise the tax rates even more." It was dealt by threatening them like that. There were talks about how the populace suffered from the political pressure in the game, but there were no detailed descriptions about that portion. It was likely that, without Norman's documents, even Kazuki wouldn't have noticed this. If the present condition lasted for a long while, the displeasure accumulated due to the pressuring of the Stokes family would without a doubt explode at some point of time. That would be the first sign of indication to the fall of the Stokes family. Well, for Kazuki, no matter what happened to this family, it didn't have anything to do with him, but the chances of him getting involved and undergoing a disastrous experience was extraordinarily high, and so there was no way he couldn't take some measures. "Excuse me." "Tay, what are you doing?" Showing his face from the open door, without even waiting for a reply from knocking the door, was the accomplice who helped in rescuing Clara, Zen, the coachman of the horse-drawn cart. Somehow, as of late, even though there was no work for him, it became as though he was involved with whatever Harold was doing. No matter how harsh his speech was, other than laughing dryly, it was as though he wasn't enduring at all. Zen was 19 years old, a youth in the same generation as Kazuki. Also, among the males who were working in the mansion, his age was the closest to Harold, and in Kazuki's mind, he was an existence that Kazuki could easily associate with. He was somewhat like a dog, or rather, it could be said that Zen's personality played a big role in making people feel friendly towards him. He tilted his head when he saw Kazuki's eccentric behavior. Even though it was called eccentric, he was just recording the growth of plants which were there on the balcony of about 50 centimeters, furnished on the window. "It is unrelated to you. Quickly, close the door. Oto, it somewhat has the scent of a secret." Closing the door behind him, as expected, Zen spouted out some dog-like remarks and peeked at the balcony. As for his attitude, it could be said that it was disrespectful at best. About 20 potted plants were lined up on the balcony, which were divided into 3 segments, and 3 types of plants were being grown. For some reason, there were some specimens among them whose growth was preeminent. Bell tubers and bluna, and also red groot. "Are you going to eat them after they grow up? Do you want me to cut out your guts and, including the pot, shove it inside your stomach? Should I make Zen eat it?" "No thanks. If it is like this, we might never have a relaxed conversation." While being depressed by that thought, his hand kept moving while recording. As Zen stated, all of these were edible vegetables. Frankly, only leaves couldn't be seen under the earth for bell tubers, and its name fit it correctly. Adding on to that, it was in the top 3 most cultivated principal crops of the agricultural community in the Stokes territory. Even so, the way they've been grown is different, isn't it? Without being cowed by Kazuki's statement, Zen asked that with a look filled with interest. A heart made of steel or tough nerves, either way, he was resilient. While admiring Zen, who seemed to have the endurance level of a sandbag, Kazuki held out a glass bottle. There are those which were watered with water mixed with this, and those which weren't. The thing held in Kazuki's hand, which was familiar to all fans of Brave Hearts, was a semi-transparent bluish bottle. The thing which was extremely handy only at the start of the game, an item which doubled the stamina recovery rate. Its name is Life Potion. Life Potion for crops. He had never heard of a technique like that to cultivate crops, but the ones which were given the Life Potion were obviously bigger and juicier. Zen's eyes showed shock at Kazuki's thinking, which wasn't bound by any common sense, but for Kazuki, it was just another simple thought. In the system of Brave Hearts, compounding existed. By mixing many different ingredients, items were created, but for some of the ingredients, if one didn't cultivate them on their own, they wouldn't be able to get their hand on them. Furthermore, even if one nurtured ingredients according to the manual, since the probability of cultivating the wanted ingredients was extremely low, the players ploughed the fields with the intentions of getting some hits. The players follow the Japanese saying, "Even a poor marksman will hit the target with enough shots." Eventually, the fact that the harvest rate goes up when Life Potion or the upper-ranked Ether is used became known, and then players who changed to Hero Come Farmer started scattering recovery items on the fields. Similarly, Kazuki was also one of those players.